who is the Member of Parliament for Harborough, Oby and Wigston, who has recently been made Shadow Minister for Renewal and Development. And then on this side we have Miriam Cates, who is the former MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge and is now a presenter on GB News. We have Kate Barker, who is the Chief Executive of the LGBT Alliance, which promotes the rights of lesbians, gay men and bisexual people. And of course, last but by no means least, we have Kath Leng, who is Head of Advocacy for Seen in Journalism, which stands for the Sex Equality and Equity Network, and it campaigns for accuracy and impartiality in media coverage. So, we've got a lot to cover, we've got a lot of panellists, so I will turn to each of them in turn for about 5 to 7 minutes to kick us off on slightly different topics so that we can cover the broad spread of how important the Supreme Court ruling has been. So Fiona, I will come to you first on some scene setting about the Supreme Court ruling and what it means. And if you can unpack for us some of the examples of organisations that are failing to comply with the ruling, just like the NHS Fife for Women Scotland case, and what you'd like to see in the upcoming EHRC guidance, and some more about what Sex Matters does.
Okay. So over the past few years, anyone with common sense who's been paying attention to this sex and gender debate may have felt like they were going mad. I know I did. Public bodies, employers, service providers, and of course the Scottish Government proclaimed that trans women are women and that all their laws and policies should make that assumption. And we were told that this was inclusive and kind and progressive, and somehow humanity had transformed itself. And we were told it was the law, and specifically that the Equality Act 2010, which protects against sex discrimination, meant that any protections for women must include trans women, which is a bit of a misnomer because trans women are men who say they are women. That meant that men were put in women's prisons, including rapists. And some of these things are so extraordinary that most people couldn't believe it was really happening. And part of the difficulty in raising the alarm was that such extraordinarily shocking things were happening that we sounded like conspiracy theorists. So yes, men in women's prisons, and by the way, that's still happening. Men were allowed to play in women's sports, as we heard from Sharon. Any of you who managed to get to the main stage just before this will have heard that. And that's still going on in many sports, from parkrun through to elite sport, international sport, from darts to rugby, and from school level to masters. Men were allowed to take the place of women on committees and on panels where there was a specific quota for women's voices. So that's a part of the Equality Act called Positive Action. It's specifically to address underrepresented groups. So if you want to address the underrepresentation of women on boards, for example, you might think that a man in a dress is not a good instance of that. And I picked that example very specifically because that's what the Supreme Court case was about. Men were allowed to be in women's refuges, and as we know, they were allowed to provide services for victims of male violence and rape, and in Scotland they were allowed to run those services. Men were allowed to volunteer in female-only roles, such as guide leaders, and Girl Guides still claim that trans women are women. Parents were told, and are still being told, that their girls were going away to camp in a female-only setting because the identity of the trans girl had to be protected, so that your girls could be sharing a tent or dormitory with a teenage boy, and no one would know. Of course, all the girls would know, because you can't really conceal the fact that a teenage boy is a boy. And of course, in the more general milieu, men were going into women's toilets, women's changing rooms, women's showers, in workplaces, in gyms, in leisure centres, everywhere. And we were told that we had to be kind, not out them, not embarrass them, not criticise them, because that would hurt their feelings. And I am not mincing my words here. I feel we all know that it's not offensive to say that a male person is a man and a female person is a woman, whether they like it or not. And in fact, we have to be able to say that, because if we can't speak the truth, we can't talk clearly about policies, about requirements, we simply cannot enforce the law. So, it's easier to say this now because the Supreme Court has said it. And until recently, you could lose your job for saying that. And if my colleague Maya Forstater were here, she would tell you she knows that from personal, painful experience. And there are still women in trouble for this. And Caroline mentioned the Sandy Peggy case in Scotland, NHS Fife. You might think that after the Supreme Court judgment, which I'll talk about in a second, that Sandy would be able to say, please can no one male come into the women's changing rooms, and that would not be considered a problem. But she tried that, she tried it again, and eventually she spoke to the man in question, a doctor, and said, you shouldn't be in here, and was suspended. And that case has been going on at a cost of, I think it must be approaching £500,000 now in legal fees. And still, she was suspended for a considerable amount of time. Then she eventually was reinstated but went sick. And here we are. That's something like £350,000 of public money from NHS Scotland defending that woman's employer for insisting that she could not object to a man in the changing rooms, in the women's changing rooms. So, and there's another case about to start this month, the Darlington nurses. So these cases are still going on. Now, it should have been obvious to everyone that these things have harmed women, but somehow the power of words, the legal hocus pocus, and it being someone else's problem managed to cast a spell, and people just kept quiet and nodded these things through, which is just a devastating lack of leadership. And it for women to realize that actually it turns out nobody really cares about us is pretty shocking in 2025. All of this happened under a Conservative government. But on the 16th of April, we came out of the Supreme Court with a judgment that was like waking up from a bad dream. It was perfect. It had never been the law for all these crazy things to happen. That's what they said. Over 2 days in November 2024, the Supreme Court had heard arguments from the Scottish Government and from For Women Scotland, that fine organisation that fought all the way to the Supreme Court, and Marion's at the back of the room. And honestly, without that, I don't know where we'd be. And the action specifically was about gender representation on public boards in Scotland, so a very specific form of positive action. But what the judges did was work their way through every single bit of the Equality Act. So in court, they heard arguments from both sides. They heard from For Women Scotland. The organisation I represent was an intervener. They heard from us. They also read arguments from a group of lesbian interveners who made including Kate Barker from LGBT Alliance. And in fact, from Amnesty International, who gave the trans arguments. And the Equality and Human Rights Commission also gave the trans argument. So they were very well represented, and of course the Scottish Government was also arguing for its interpretation. So, after all that, all those well-organised, well-funded organisations argued till they were blue in the face that trans women were women if they had a piece of paper saying so. And us grassroots startups, upstarts with no money and no Christian alt-right fortune that I've ever come across, made our cases. Those 5 judges said on April the 16th, the emperor has no clothes. So, they basically said, and it's really not complicated, is it? Everywhere in the Equality Act, where it says sex, where it says male or female, where it says man or woman, boy or girl, that's about your body, it's about your biology, it's not about anything else. It cannot change because the only reason those stipulations are being made in the Equality Act is because that is when sex matters. So, the only way to protect women's rights is to recognise that women are a coherent category of people. I think this is a massive indictment against every politician who repeated the pieties and enacted the policies. Every public body and regulator that replaced sex with gender identity and looked away from the harms that it was causing. Not just to women and girls, but to vulnerable children, boys and girls, who were told they could be born in the wrong body. And they're still being told that in schools. Every professional body, every respectable charity and media organisation and university and all those celebrities who did it, and the Church of England, I could go on. No wonder we felt like we were going mad. This has been an incredible David and Goliath story of a few plucky women and a few men fighting back against institutional capture. So for women, Scotland took the case to the highest court in the land. The Supreme Court said they were right and we were right, and we had not lost our minds, and the judgment's incredibly powerful. There's been a lot of talk about toilets since the judgment, and toilets do matter, because actually, as female people know, we can feel quite vulnerable in there. You know, most of the time it's fine. It doesn't mean we know it's going to be fine. So that sounds relatively trivial, but it affects our daily lives, all of us, all the time. But the Equality Act is not a who goes in which toilets act. It's the act that says when businesses and public bodies must treat men and women the same, so as not to discriminate, and when it is lawful to treat them differently, so as not to discriminate. And in fact, where it may be sex discrimination, not to treat them differently and make specific provision for men. And sport is the most obvious example, isn't it? It's obviously the only fair way to provide sport for women is to give us our own category. Because if you treat everyone as a default man, then women are disadvantaged and locked out of public life. And that's particularly important for public bodies because they have a public sector equality duty and they have to consider the impact on different people. And this is the most important point from the For Women Scotland judgment. If you're doing something for women, then it has to be for women, whether that's sports, spaces, awards, and laws. So let me just tell you where we are now. We came out of that courtroom, where's Marion? We remember, we came out of there and it was like waking up from a bad dream. But it seems like an awful lot of organisations have not yet woken up. And many of them are hostile to the judgment. It's kind of extraordinary to see people, essentially mouthing off that those judges got it wrong. I think their brains have been broken by the illogicality of trying to treat some men as women and thinking that makes them the good guys. So now they can't bear to be the bad guys. And they remain afraid of trans activists and often afraid of their own children, young adult children particularly. So Sex Matters, that I represent, sees three risks now. 1, organisations flout the law and refuse to comply. 2, organisations decide that if they can't do things for women, including trans women, that they won't do them for women at all. And 3, organisations want to follow the law, but they can't because the data's messed up. Because so many institutions, including people like the Passport Office and the DVLA, have let people change the sex marker on their official documents without any supervision at all. Something like 100,000 sex markers have been changed. That's nothing to do with the Gender Recognition Act. And also because it's still too dangerous for them to say that trans women are men. So there's still an awful lot of work to do. We shouldn't be surprised. It took 20 years of institutional capture to get here, and it's going to take us years to get back to sanity. But now we know the law's on our side. So, a couple of specifics. If you're a councillor or a school governor, you can make a difference, or part of any organisation, in fact, or business, you can use the law to get your organisation back on track. And often, actually, that does start with toilets, because they are universal. And we can push and support our politicians to be leaders on the issue. Kemi Badenoch is on the right side, and she's been outspoken about this, because it will take political leadership to get gender ideology out of our schools and institutions. And if none of that works, and frankly, we're not waiting for all that, we can sue them. So we're currently suing the National Police Chiefs Council, the CPS, Crime Prosecution Service, and the City of London Corporation over their failure to respond to the judgment. Let me say briefly about a couple of those. So the City of London Corporation runs Hampstead Ponds, public swimming ponds. There's a ladies' pond, a men's pond, and a mixed pond, everyone provided for. There is no earthly reason why they should let men who say they're women into the ladies' pond. You'd think that would be obvious. It's apparently not obvious to them. They will find out. And we hope that that will give us a nice, clear judgment that we can then leverage and that will cascade. We were, until Monday, suing the Scottish Government as an employer. So if we think of workplaces and service providers as two big areas that need to be challenged, the Scottish Government is a workplace. City of London Corporation's a pond, is a service provider. I'm sure I've called them worse. The Scottish Government caved to our challenge on Monday and withdrew the line in their internal policy that said that people who identified out of their sex could choose whatever facilities they wanted. But you may have seen that the Union for Public Sector Workers, the PCS, in Leith, has told its employees to ignore that. So that's how hard this is going to be. On our website, we've got guidance on how to complain to gyms and leisure centres and other service providers. And one final thing, we've written to all the local authorities across Great Britain where the judgment applies, because they have a legal duty as employers and as service providers. So, you know, they provide services to the general public. They often run gyms, libraries, obviously leisure centres and so on, and of course schools. Plenty of schools are still under local authority control, and they're still teaching children that they can be born in the wrong body and that girls must be kind. In other words, let the boys have what they want. And we've written to them all, and the answers are inadequate, I'll say. All the usual excuses. And so I'm wondering, why doesn't the leader of the Conservative Party write to all the local authorities that are controlled by the Conservatives and simply direct them to comply with the law? It's not controversial anymore. So that's the scene. We're here to fight, and we're going to hear about some of the other areas where we're fighting now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Fiona. That was a very helpful background to where we're at and why we're here today. Miriam, I'll come to you next and then on to Neil. I know you both have a strong interest on this area and the impact on children, particularly on girls. And many people will have seen your campaigns, Miriam, while you're an MP or watched you on your show. But what some people might not know is that I think I'm right in saying you're a biology teacher in schools, so you've seen it firsthand as well, and you know the importance of teaching children about the truth. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about some of your time on various campaigns on this subject and anything else you'd like to set the scene on.
Thanks. Well, I was a biology teacher, but actually when I stopped teaching to raise my children in 2011, this wasn't a thing. And I think that shows just how rapidly it's taken over in schools, and certainly biology was a real subject when I was teaching, but anyway, that's what changed. I first came across this issue, this idea that men can become women and vice versa. A few years before I was elected as an MP, I knew of some people in our local area, some acquaintances who had teenage children who were going through this at school, girls particularly, who decided that they were actually boys and were being accepted by the school in that male identity. And you know, I'm from Sheffield. I had lived in Sheffield all my life. It's extremely left-wing. It's known as the Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire for good reason. And so I assumed that this was a kind of anomaly for Sheffield, which has all sorts of anomalies. But it wasn't until I got into Parliament in 2019 and people started writing to me about what was going on in different schools. And I got to know a fantastic organisation called Bayswater Support Group. I don't know if any of you are aware of them. And they are the unsung heroes of this, because they're all parents who have been really through the mill because they have children who identify as trans, but have decided on principle not to accept that trans identity. And some of them have been referred to social services. Some of them had their children taken away from them. So they've had huge battles with schools and often other family members over this issue, but they've stayed true to what they believe is the right thing. And actually some of them have seen their children come out the other end and renounce the trans identity, which has been amazing. But I came across them and they started telling me and Anne some of the kind of stories that we are all now familiar with. And I stood up in Parliament and spoke about some of this. And then more people wrote to me. And then it became very, very clear that actually this was not a one-off issue, that this was endemic in many of our schools. schools and we dug into it a bit more and saw that actually some of the things that were being taught in schools, not just caught from social media, were actively encouraging children to believe this lie that men can become women, or that there is such a thing as gender identity. And, of course, lo and behold, as so many of those things, the Conservative government had waved these things through, and the guidance to the RSHE curriculum, which became compulsory in 2019, has some very odd instructions like teach the law and the facts about gender identity. Of course, there is no law about gender identity, and there certainly aren't any facts about it. So you can see how schools have become very confused, and as a former teacher myself, I completely understand how a biology teacher or a history teacher who is told it's your turn to teach PSHE today just goes on YouTube the night before and types in video about gender identity. I mean, that is literally what happens in schools. So I don't think it's all intentional brainwashing. Some of this is just the guidance was so poor and the teachers were so ill-informed that they did what they had to do in the circumstances. Of course, the rest is history. And I think when we look at what's happening in the media, we have won great strides in this country through the bravery of people like Sex Matters, J.K. Rowling, of course, the Supreme Court judgment. And it is astonishing now that all our mainstream media and all our mainstream papers are happy to print gender-critical pieces. There's probably a few exceptions around the edge, and that just isn't the case in a lot of countries, and that's why we're called Turf Island. And I do think we are winning the air war, but the ground war still has a long way to go because of how institutionalized these ideas have become. But I do think that children are starting to push back, and we are the only country actually in the West where the divergence between young men and young women in terms of political views is actually turning a corner, and young women are slightly becoming less liberal. There's still a massive gap between boys and girls, but we do seem to be the only country that has turned the corner. And I wonder if that is because we've had so much coverage of men in women's prisons and these kind of reality checks. And in one of my children's school, I'm going to be as anonymous about this as possible. There were year 9s. The teacher brought up some video about gender. It was his turn to teach PSHE. And before it loaded up, the boys, they're 14, started shouting out, "Sir, sir, there are only 2 sexes. Donald Trump says so." And at that point, he lost the room. And I think that is what's going to happen. Now, as a Conservative, it grieves me that children are rejecting their teacher's authority. I think that is a problem. But nevertheless, I do think that the kind of brainwashing that we've seen is time limited. So that's good. I'm going to let Neil talk a lot more about the detail, but I just want to end with one final thing, which is that lots of us understand that this is just a lie. Men can't become women. Women are not the same as men. I mean, you said I was a biology teacher. I've got a degree in genetics. I can tell you that there's XX chromosomes and there's XY. Okay, it's just a very simple biological fact that we can observe from nature and history and all those kind of things. But we've got to understand that the reason this lie has taken hold is not because we've gone through some sort of collective madness, but because the pitch has been rolled for it by decades, in fact, of the kinds of ideas that have said men and women should be the same, or even all cultures should be the same. Those kind of liberal ideas that are thought experiments, because I think anybody with a scientific background or anybody capable of observing reality and history knows that those things aren't true. And I think sometimes feminists haven't helped themselves by saying things like women should achieve the same outcomes as men. Motherhood is drudgery, men should look after the babies. Those kind of things that have actually been well meant but have rolled the pitch for people to be able to claim, for men to be able to claim, well, why can't we be women? So I think as we hopefully come out of this collective madness, and there is some way to go, I think we also need to look at where sex matters, which isn't just in toilets and workplaces. Actually, it matters in an awful lot of life. The difference between men and women is really the foundation of what we know of as society. And I think we need to rebuild what we mean by male roles, female roles, not in a restrictive way, but just in a biologically sensible way that gives people the opportunity to be a mother or a father, and not pretend they're the same thing, and those kind of things. So I think we just need to be careful as we move on that we don't fall into a similar trap in some other area.
Miriam, straight over to you, Neil.
Well, I have terrible, terrible imposter syndrome, not least as obviously the token man on the panel here, but because I'm in a room, on a panel and in a room full of people who have made huge sacrifices and done incredibly distinguished things to make the progress that we have done. So I am humbled to be with you. And it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. So back in about 2022 or 23, I was working in the Levelling Up department alongside my fellow junior minister, Kemi Badenoch, and the Scottish government had decided it would try and do self-ID, and it would try and export that to the rest of the UK, and there was then a vigorous debate in government about what we should do, and Kemi and I both thought this was completely insane and had to be resisted, no matter what. And everyone told us it's completely inevitable. Self-ID is the way of the future. This is what's going to happen. We better just get on with it. And it turned out it wasn't inevitable. In fact, it wasn't us having to accept self-ID. It was Nicola Sturgeon and her caravan heading off into the distance. So we won that one. But nonetheless, we have still a huge problem. Between 2011 and 2021 alone, we had a 50-fold increase in the number of kids with a GP diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and it is tragic. And the bit I want to talk about is education, because before I was doing this job on policy, I was doing education brief and looking at what is being taught in our schools and beyond. And really, again, I'm an imposter because I'm just drawing on the fantastic work done by Miriam and others, and Caroline Fisk and others, about what's happening in our schools. And it seems to me that, exactly as has been said, our schools are not doing what they should, which is to correct the kind of nonsense that kids are seeing on social media, instead doubling down on it and making it worse. And if I was going to sort of intellectually put what is wrong with sex education in schools under a few different headings, and I think there is a wider problem about sex education in schools that goes beyond just a gender ideology. It's partly that it's just all too much too young. It's partly that transition is being presented as uncomplicated and very, very reversible. It's partly that what teachers are doing is crossing the line from explaining to promoting something in a way that is illegal under the 1996 Act. And it's situated in a wider context, which is so-called sex positive and relationship negative. And just to explain those things a little bit, so when I say too much too young, so Wiltshire Pride handed out in primary schools in Wiltshire leaflets that talked about the 300 different pride flags and took primary school children through trisexualism and, quotes, the many identities of the fetish spectrum. And I just don't think that that is appropriate for primary school kids. I've got a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old at primary school. I just don't think that is right. I don't think, by the way, we should be teaching kids at 9 and 10 about masturbation either. That's a wider point. Again, on gender ideology, you have in secondary schools, you have things like in Matlock Highfield School, they had a drag workshop against the objection of the local women's rights network, who said that, this is basically adult entertainment. It's adult entertainment basically for men, but it's being done in a school. And of course, the kids all meet this drag queen, and then if you go on his or her website, it will tell you all sorts of stuff and sex videos and blowjobs and all this kind of stuff. But just this is not education, right? This is the promotion of something that is not the right thing to be promoting to kids, and it's situated in a wider context, which I think is very concerning about the relationships between men and women. There was some advice generated by Bridgend Council in Wales, which is all about safe choking in sex for kids, and it was saying, you've got to get consent before you do the choking, right? And kids are seeing some of this terrible stuff online, and it really worries me. And when I was at school, it wasn't that long ago. It was the 1990s. Oasis were topping the charts. It wasn't that long ago. And if our teachers had said, "This is all right to choke your girlfriend during sex," we'd have been told no, right? It would have been a bit simpler than it is now. It's not about consent. It's awful. It's degrading women. It's just appalling. So there's this wider context here where we're just hitting kids with too much too young, and then we are telling them in all the textbooks of all the leading providers that gender transition is just really easy to reverse. You can stop any time. So just to read out so Brooke and Gendered Intelligence, who are big providers, they say there's no risk. Your suspended puberty will resume if you stop taking the pills. It's not right. It's not medically correct. Collins is one of the biggest educational textbook providers. Their book, Your Choice, says some people want to change their gender through surgery or hormone treatment, but not everyone does. So you're normalising this thing. It's an incredibly extreme thing for kids, and you're presenting it as exciting, normal, totally reversible. There's no risk. I mean, you ask Kira Bell about that, or Chloe Cole, or people of detransition. They will tell you this is not medically correct. So we're telling kids a bunch of lies, and the teachers are crossing the line from. I'm happy for them to explain that some people have a view. I would rather they said some people think there are 300 genders. These people are mad, but that's their view. But they're not doing that. They are drilling kids in a catechism. It's not that there's someone's view. You've got to learn the catechism. It's the truth. There are these many things. And I find it very weirdly un-PC. So we've come sort of full circle. So a book that's in an awful lot of primary schools is called I Am Jazz. It has nice illustrations. It's a primary school age book. And it says, little boy, and it says, well, I have a girl brain but a boy body. So hands up in the room, who's got a girl brain, who's got a boy brain? Let's try and, how have we drifted back to all this stuff? And again, with the breast binders, we used to sort of think of the Victorians, how ridiculous the Victorians were with these corsets warping women's shape. Completely ridiculous. And now you have, in mainstream textbooks, you have, breast binding. It's fun and freeing. Fun and freeing to cut off your perfectly healthy breasts in a mainstream textbook. So we've got to stop people from crossing the line into promoting this stuff. And a lot of it is driven by people who have a sex-positive ideology, and they think that anything that suggests you might do anything other than have relentless casual sex is out of touch with the Tinder generation. And some of this is our fault, right? So some of this started to happen particularly because of the 2014 guidance, drawn up, interestingly, outside the department with very radical groups that introduced the concept of gender ideology into teaching, and they ran and ran and ran with that. We, thanks to the efforts of people like Miriam, realised our mistake towards the end of the government we produced. In 2023, we wrote guidance for gender questioning children in schools. We consulted on it in December 2023. Has it issued? It's nearly 2026. No, the government are still thinking about it. Bridget Phillipson does not want to handle this hot potato. And a similar, our 2014 guidance, the government's produced the total damp squib, and just on and on and on and on we go with all this terrible stuff being taught in our schools. And I think it's cruel. Right, so I go into a lot of primary schools, you go into the library and it's Pride Month or whatever, and there's all these books, even in primary schools, teaching kids really terrible ideas. And I remember what it was like being a kid, like particularly as a teenage boy, it's like a confusing time, you're finding out a lot of things. And I remember my very, very nice form teacher, again, like all these people, teaching all this important stuff, he wasn't a specialist in this subject. And he was asked about gay people and he said, well, I think some people are trapped in the wrong body. And he was trying to be nice. The tragedy is he was trying to be nice. And he's totally wrong. That's not what gay people are. And through trying to be nice and accommodating a bunch of people with radical gender ideology ideas, militant people with very strange backgrounds often, we've allowed them to propagandise kids with ideas that are extremely harmful to them. And it's tough enough being a teenager anyway. The normal ups and downs of being a teenager, you're finding out who you are. Maybe you're gay, maybe you're not, maybe whatever. But to tell kids that they might be trapped in the wrong body, what a terrifying idea to be trapped in the wrong body, and to be told that everything is so complicated and to be celebrated. To be an interesting person, you should really be picking for one of these 300 flags that you should be identifying with. It's so unhelpful, and the result is tragic. The result is all these kids with mental health problems are often being put on a transition pathway towards pills or even surgery that is irreversible, and they will come to regret. It's just tragic. We can and we will do something about it. I can promise you that Kemi Badenoch really, really gets this. And if we get into government, we made mistakes in government, big mistakes, but we will hit all this stuff with an absolute nuclear bomb. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil.
Very good.
Kate, I'll come to you next for some thoughts from your organisation, LGB Alliance, in particular the influence on young gay people, lesbians, bisexual people, and particularly on the health aspect of this as well, which I think is really important and we haven't touched on it yet. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. To be clear, the Supreme Court ruling matters to same-sex attracted people because unless you've got a clear definition of what sex means, you can't defend our rights. So that was our starting point. And actually, I was really delighted quite soon after the ruling to be invited on Women's Hour to talk about LGB Alliance and to talk about the Supreme Court. So to kind of set the scene, when I was on there, I was talking about lesbians who having to put up with straight men, heterosexual men, who said they were lesbians and put themselves onto dating apps and insist on going to lesbian spaces. And the presenter said to me, well, some trans women do identify as lesbians. What would you say to that? And I said, well, but men can't be lesbians. And she kind of paused and in a hushed tone said to the audience, I know many of you will find that offensive. I kind of thought, do people find it offensive, the idea that a lesbian is a woman? And if that's the case, how did we get here? And I think what it is we've had 15 years of the LGBTQ plus lobby trying to swap out the reality of sex that we all recognise and understand with this sort of nebulous idea of gender and identity and, it's essentially how you feel inside. The BBC has been particularly captured by this, which hasn't helped. I know Kath's going to talk about that. But it's all in an effort to kind of pull out the rug of reality from under all of our feet. So for lesbians of my age, it's been absolutely infuriating, the idea that largely straight men can waltz around saying they're lesbians. But it's been infuriating, but I'm absolutely secure in the knowledge that I'm completely right and it's a lot of nonsense. But it isn't the same for children. If you're aged, or a young person, if you're aged between 15 and 30, you've never really known a world where this hasn't been happening. So everybody who's same-sex attracted, who's about that age, has been told that effeminate boys might really be girls, and that girls who like short hair and sport and they're tomboys and they're attracted to girls, well, that's therefore evidence that they really are a boy, which is absolutely terrifying. And it's really what you were saying, Neil, about this born in the wrong body narrative, which is a quasi-religious fiction that has been peddled as fact in schools. So you've got the tiny children getting books like Grandpa's Pride, which has got Grandpa and his fishnets. And, I mean, honestly, Grandpa and his fishnets at the Pride celebration, with lots of young girls shown with mastectomy scars. That's really appearing commonly now in children's literature as something to be celebrated, that kind of mutilation. And then you've got groups who are parachuting into schools. And again, I think it's what you were saying, Miriam, that people need to have a lesson plan and they need it quick. Or if a consultant comes along and they're going to do a presentation to the school, they think, fantastic. So groups like Pop and Ollie, they drop in with their flags and their quizzes, and they're asking children to choose a gender or to choose a sexuality, asking a small child who they're sexually attracted to. And it's made very clear that heterosexuality, which of course is the norm, is the dull choice. And you're asked to be a little bit more imaginative and you could pick something else. And then you've got stars like Emma Watson and David Tennant, yeah, boo. But they're actively promoting really pernicious organisations like Mermaids who are mutilating children, and it's terrible for all children, but for LGB children it's particularly bad. LGB kids are particularly vulnerable to this kind of messaging. They may already feel a bit different to their peers. All teenagers hate feeling different. We all want a tribe. And they're very easily persuaded that a kind of a latent homosexuality, which when you're very young you don't really understand, it's just kind of a feeling that's maybe a little bit unsettling, makes you feel a little bit different. They're really easily persuaded that latent homosexuality is something that needs to be fixed. And if they're offered the idea of transitioning, well, that seems amazing. That seems like all the problems solved. Remember as well that being gender non-conforming is very common in children who then grow up to be happily gay. Not all kids who are gender non-conforming grow up to be gay, but a lot of them do. And if you add into that the kind of plaudits and the praise that they'll get from teachers, if you're quite a slightly awkward, slightly vulnerable kid, and your favourite teacher is going to stand you up in front of the class and say, look how brave so-and-so is, and all you kids really need to work hard to be nice to them as well. It's just, and if that's the carrot, and then the stick is the kids are going online and learning that if they're not affirmed in this course of action, so many kids will kill themselves, which is, it's shocking and astonishing that kind of narrative is peddled to children. And we know that it's true. In the Tavistock Clinic, their figures showed that, which is the gender clinic, their figures showed that 89% of the girls and 81% of the boys said that they were gay or bi. I mean, that's an astonishingly high number. The Caster Review, of course, talks about the fact that sexual orientation must be something that's considered in assessing children like this. And there was a joke circulating at the Tavistock, which was, soon there'll be no gay kids left if we carry on at this rate. So they knew. You know, these are majority gay children that find themselves challenged like this in this way. And it's just the latest in iteration in what's a really long and ugly history of the medicalisation of homosexuality. And Kemi was absolutely right to say it's about transing away the gay. You know, she was absolutely spot on with that. And it's a horrible irony that the same drugs that are given to block a child's puberty in this case were the same drugs given to Alan Turing, who was given a choice when he was discovered to be homosexual. Either go to prison or take these drugs to chemically castrate yourself. And he chose the drugs and killed himself not very long after. So it's a horrible, horrible circular piece of history to consider. So we're really pleased that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are effectively banned by the NHS. We are really, really worried about private providers and the way they seem to be finding loopholes and exploiting them. Gender GP and Trans Healthcare, both run by two absolute zealots, desperate to push their drugs onto vulnerable children, and then who manipulate terrified parents as well about the likelihood of their children committing suicide if they don't receive these life-saving treatments. And we don't know how many there are. Last year, Gender GP boasted that they had 10,000 patients, and there were tons of clinics and like this operating. So, you know, there's a huge number, and I think the fallout from this is going to be profound. We're going to have a generation of young people who've been permanently damaged. They may be sterile. They are going to ask, how did you let this happen to me? It's a huge problem. Now, we at LGBT Alliance, we've launched a helpline for young people who are same-sex attracted. And we've had calls from people who've regretted their transition, and they've realised that they were simply lesbian or gay and that there was never anything wrong with their body. But there is a great deal wrong with the capture of the medical establishment by a fanciful and malign ideology that tells gay people that they can be cured by making grotesque and permanent changes to their body. So this is, I don't think I'm exaggerating to say, this is an evil that is being visited on majority gay young people. The Supreme Court ruling clarified that sex means biological sex, and our task now has to be to strip out the poisonous homophobia of gender identity ideology from public life wherever we can. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. And last but by no means least, Kath, I'll come to you. Now, you've had first-hand experience of being hounded out of the workplace because of this. Tell us a bit more about what Seen in Journalism does, and then I will come straight out to the floor. I know time is marching on, so please do get your brief questions ready, and I'll come straight out.
I'll be very quick. Yeah, we work to restore accuracy and impartiality in journalism across the media. And I'm just going to veer from what I was going to say a little bit, because what everybody's been talking about, I think we're all in kind of a bubble of understanding in this room. But what Fiona was talking about, these extraordinary things, people thought you were conspiracy theorists, the horror of having a child taken from a family because of the impact of family transition, the scandalous things that are happening in schools. We know about them because we are the resources, whether that knowledge is imparted or available to us. But if you're in doubt, if you're a parent, where do you go? You go to the BBC, think, can this be real? Is this really true? And the BBC tells you, yes, it is. Yes, puberty blockers are reversible. Yes, your child may commit suicide. It hasn't interviewed a single detransitioner yet, except for Kira Bell on Newsnight when she had her case. But it hasn't done any of that human experience. For 10 years, it did trans women going for etiquette lessons, or an LGBT person was kicked out of a Zoom group because somebody said something, you know. And this is where we are at the moment. It was total capture, and there has been some move. It took six months to get the story out on the BBC about lesbians fearing men in their dating app groups. Remember that one?
Yeah.
6 months. And there's a reported threat to resign if we published it from internally. The internal resistance was astonishing. So where we are today, so that's 10 years. Things have improved. We did get rid of Stonewall. They did get rid of mermaids. But the inconvenient thing about rights is you can't exercise them if you don't know you have them. And when you've got employers and service providers, unions, even citizens' advice, they're hiding it. They're determined not to tell you what the law actually is, and it is very straightforward. Then that's where we're supposed to step in, and that's where we haven't stepped in. So I will just, we don't only focus on the BBC, but I will just, because it makes it easier and quicker this time, is that since April 16th, it has been very patchy. So we had one good piece about the law brings clarity. We then had Lord Sumption on PM, Evan Davis, actually giggling with glee that he said trans women can go into women-only spaces. He got the law completely wrong. Did immense damage. It's still doing damage today. It's had to be inserted into every single BBC fact check since then. And basically, you're not getting all the BBC needs to do is a fact check. The April 16th was an opportunity for it to provide the fact checks to escape the straitjacket of affirmation, which it's been in since 2013, and to say this is the truth about biological sex. This is where the law stands. This is the impact of puberty blockers. These are the real statistics about suicide. The reason it hasn't done it, there's no reason for it not to do it, except that it doesn't want to, and it is afraid of activists. Like, there are all sorts of factors. It's very multifactorial. You can talk about a sort of sclerotic bureaucracy. You can talk about complacency and people who think it's niche. Pronouns are just niche. It's just being nice. But at the heart, burning heart of it, is activism. Right? They don't want to poke that bear. And it's internal activism, which is very determined, perhaps not so vocal, but people whose job it is to implement whatever ruling may be very determined believers, can I say? So they're not going to do it. They'll say, yes, we'll do that. They'll say yes, they'll nod and they'll smile and just ignore it. And external activists, complaint activism is very, very powerful. People will send in dozens and dozens of complaints, and because you have a captured complaints unit, instead of biffing them off and saying, this piece was accurate, thank you very much for your, we'll share your views, or whatever they say to all of us whenever we complain, they pass them all to they pass them down to the correspondence. So if you get in literally dozens of complaints, if you just say something like, estrogen is given to males when they want to transition, something like that. The very fact that you have said the word males instead of calling them women, they will get dozens of complaints, and instead of the complaints unit saying, it's fine, just go away, they pass them all on to the correspondents and the producers, and they have to spend their working time dealing with it. So it makes them much less likely to want to do the story. And that means they just get rejected for... Contentiousness isn't generally the reason. It was given to me as a reason for rejecting a story about family transition one time. But they have many, many ways of doing it. What's the news peg? It's not the right time. So that situation still obtains mainly because of activism, that they don't want to, they're afraid of literally the amount of work that it will cause them. I have been to a number of phrases used to us when we've suggested taking self-identification out of the style guide at the BBC. It would set off a landmine under the newsroom. It would take an army of committees to do this. In fact, we said to somebody really, really high up, look, why don't you just take it out? You don't have to say default to biological sex. Just say we're not going to automatically call men women anymore. And he said, you think it's easy. Do you have any idea what it would take to do that? And so what we do is we want, first of all, we want the affirmation to end completely. We want the BBC to default to biological sex in its style guide. We want all legacy outlets to do that. And the reason is for safeguarding. It's what Fiona was talking about. It's an editorial safeguarding issue. If you are asking the question, why should she not be in a women's prison, you need that's a question you have to answer. It's a default entry into a women's prison. When the question is, why should he not be in a women's prison? The answer is obvious. He shouldn't be in a women's prison. It's a default no. So the basis of safeguarding is a group protection. And what we do across the media, we all do it. Every single outlet still functions on a basis of self-identification of sex. We undermine that public understanding of safeguarding by turning everything into a case-by-case basis. And so that matters for everybody. That matters for women, children, LGBT people. And it's what I would say is a foundational corruption of public understanding of this issue. So that's what we have a number of, we engage with, we also have captured regulators, of course, so engage with the regulators and news outlets. We encourage people to complain. We ourselves complain a lot. We're also trying to go to the source of the problem. We've recently seen some very captured teaching materials for journalism courses. So they come in, the young kids come in, and the old middle-aged men in these editorial executive positions across, they think that the kids know what's going on. They defer to them as experts. Of course, they're not experts. They're just completely brainwashed. So I'll leave it there because I think give time for questions.
Yes, brilliant. Right, we probably only have time for one round of questions, but I know that there will be a group of these fantastic people outside the room afterwards, so please do take conversation outside and carry it on, and also please do come to the LGBT Alliance stand in the exhibition hall if you'd like to talk to any of these people later on. Right, there's lots of hands on this side, so I will start at the front here, and then I'll sort of work my way back. I'll take it in three, so this lady in the front here, over there, then on the second row back, and then I will go to the back of the room to the lady with her hand up standing.
So I wrote this morning, but after that I'm not quite sure.
If you can.
Yeah, the wording's quite right. So I'm optimistic the Supreme Court ruling and the EHRC Code of Practice could have a ripple effect on how public institutions and especially councils implement their public sector equality duty. I'd like to think women like myself might have less of a battle when explaining how many services and facilities should return to being provided on the default basis of sex, and that gender questioning / queerness might stop being promoted as an aspirational lifestyle for children, e.g. anyone under the age of 18, not young people. Is this optimism misplaced? And if it is, what extra can women have in our arsenal to achieve the restoration of sex-based provision and to stop our children being indoctrinated?
Brilliant. And then we'll come over to the second row over here.
Thank you. If candidates have to sign up to coming out of the ECHR to stand for the Conservatives, should they also have to stand up that there are only two sexes stroke genders?
And then lastly, lady standing right at the back.
Thank you. I work in a school and I'm a governor for another multi-academy trust, and I'm really struggling on the toilet situation. I've sent them Michael Foran's legal advice, I've sent them your Sex Matters legal advice on cubicles, and they're insisting cubicles are rooms because the school regulation says if it's in a self-contained lockable room, but these are just cubicles. So the Academy Trust I work for and the one that I'm a governor for use the same legal team, and they've been as helpful as a chocolate teapot. So where do I go as a governor from that on the toilet cubicle situation?
Brilliant. I'll come to Fiona first. Less than a minute, please, though.
Yeah, let me pick up on Lee's question about, is there grounds for optimism? What can we do? The grounds for optimism are that all the polling, all the focus groups, all the research shows that our view is the majority view, and if we collectively act, we find our voices, we complain, we push, we challenge, we will win, we will prevail. So I do think there's grounds for optimism, but, I like Miriam's notion of the ground war. This is the ground war now, it's hand-to-hand combat, and you're an example of that. I think until we have more legal precedent set, people will continue to argue that it's not clear, it's confusing, and that specific issue about is a cubicle a self-contained one is a hard one to argue with. But of course, if those really were single-sex toilets, there wouldn't ever have been a sign on the door, would there? Yeah, but it shows you that some people are determined not to enforce the law.
Okay. Anybody else on that? Unless we'll wrap up because I'm afraid we're at the end of our time.
What about the candidates?
Oh, yeah.
Well,
That's a great idea.
as Kimmy said the other day on ECHR specifically, everyone obviously every time has to support the manifesto, and I'm sure we all want to say lots of things about this in our manifesto. Absolutely, yeah.
Brilliant. Well, as I said, please do carry on the conversation outside. Particularly, I have been ably supported to put on this event by the wonderful, much better Caroline than I, Caroline Fisk. So thank you. There's plenty more to come here at the Onward Hub, so please do come back here in 15 minutes for From Welfare to Work. Thank you.
Well done.